through close analysis with individuals who are narcissistically disturbed, I found that internal injuries, again, however minor they may seem from the outside, can feel annihilating from within, leading to cruel enactments as a form of psychic survival. This means that attacking or devaluing the other becomes the only available way to stabilize a collapsing internal world. In these moments, cruelty serves a function to disown unbearable feelings, restore a fleeting sense of control, and protect the self from fragmentation. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to do something a little different. And honestly, I couldn't be more excited. Why, you may be asking? Because this is episode 100. That's right, we've hit triple digits, and I want to start by thanking each and every one of you who has been on this journey with me. Whether you've been listening since the very beginning, or you just found the show, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick with me for the next 100 episodes. So much has happened since we started this podcast. You've probably noticed I've brought guests on to the show. I shared clips of interviews that I've done on other podcasts, and most recently, I launched something I've been thinking about for some time, Office Hours, a space where listeners can bring real questions and experiences. I've now run 2 small group editions of Office Hours, where we gather to explore painful relational dynamics, ask tough questions, and really try to make sense of narcissism in our partners, in ourselves, and in the ways we relate to others. So to celebrate this 100th edition, I want to give you a sneak peek into Office Hours, especially if you've been thinking about joining. Today, I'll share a powerful moment from one of those sessions where someone detailed an example of how their spouse was treating them. They were asking a big and I think very common question: is my partner a narcissist? I want to share, in part, how I responded to her question, not only to help her find clarity, but to offer insight for anyone out there grappling with similar uncertainty. Maybe you've asked yourself the same question. Maybe you've tried to decode the emotional confusion in your relationship. Or maybe you're beginning to recognize some of the narcissistic traits that I discuss on this podcast in yourself. I want to walk us through not just what was happening in this specific example, but why someone, again, maybe even you, might find themselves becoming dismissive or emotionally abusive. Why is that enacted? Or let me say, how does that get activated? What unconscious wounds or defense mechanisms might be driving these destructive patterns? A listener of the podcast and a participant in the group shared during one of our office hour sessions that she left her spouse after about 30 years of marriage when it became clear to her that she was being emotionally abused. She spoke about how her ex-husband insisted that she had a personality disorder, and according to him, she bullied and abused him for the duration of their marriage, while he, the stand-up guy, sucked it up for years. He told her, because of your upbringing, you hate yourself, and you're attacking me in a bid to make me feel as bad about myself as you do about yourself. You could hear, I think, that that's a pretty complicated, what we call in my field, interpretation. But it didn't stop there. He also called her evil, vindictive, and retaliatory. Whenever she brought up feeling hurt by something he said or did, his response was always the same. I didn't do anything, or that wasn't my intention. And so, in his framing, Any pain she experienced was simply a misperception, a distortion caused by her childhood trauma. This left her wondering whether he actually understood how hurtful his behavior was. Any attempt to address the way he hurt her was met with defensiveness, aggression, and emotional shutdown. There was never a real conversation or resolution to any issue, she said, and nothing ever changed. As I listened to her story, I kept her central question in mind. Was my ex-husband a narcissist? But as she spoke, what struck me wasn't just the content of what she was saying. It was the emotional logic underneath it, the pattern, the consistency, the way her experience had been systematically invalidated, reversed, and pathologized. I found myself thinking about the kinds of defensive structures that can make someone incapable of recognizing another person's emotional reality, and instead twist that reality into something they must control or destroy. In other words, he destroyed her reality. That's what led me to think about, and for those of you who have been with me, you know this concept of projection. I thought about projection and how often in narcissistic dynamics, one cannot tolerate certain feelings, impulses, or flaws in themselves, so they locate them in the other person. In other words, they project, they evacuate, they get rid of these feelings. So, for example, her ex-husband appears to have persistently disowned his own aggression, projecting it into her while claiming the moral high ground. His narrative that she's the abuser, driven unconsciously by childhood trauma, ironically mirrors a classic defensive maneuver often seen in narcissistic pathology. Accuse the other of what you cannot bear in yourself. Again, that's the projection. Textbook projection. And as we discovered, she was made to carry the emotional disturbance, and over time, she began to identify with being the pathological one. Again, we discussed this concept of projective identification, just a little bit more complicated, but in short, it just means that you begin to identify with what's being projected into you. His refusal to acknowledge her hurt, his insistence that her perceptions are distorted by her past, and his ongoing invalidation of her emotional reality all suggest a deeper psychological structure marked by several key dynamics. An inability to tolerate the emergence of a separate other, someone with her own thoughts, feelings, and point of view. A failure to see her as, again in my field, what we call a whole person. Instead, she was what we discussed this in the group, a part object. She became a kind of screen onto which he could project the parts of himself he cannot tolerate. In his mind, she didn't have an independent emotional life. There's an inability to bear guilt or take responsibility, even if unintentionally, for causing someone's pain.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. There's an inability to recognize emotional reality unless it mirrors his own. In other words, if she experienced something differently, it wasn't just a disagreement, a different perspective. It was a threat to his self-coherence. And that's why it leads to such an intense fight, the blaming and trying to persuade her that she's pathological. Why? Because she doesn't see it his way. And finally, his behavior reveals an omnipotent need to control reality itself, a demand for sameness. She had to see things his way, or else she was dismissed as what? You remember, evil, crazy, or fundamentally disordered. All of these defenses left her suspended in self-doubt, vulnerable to internalizing his distorted narrative and unsure of what was real. And while no diagnosis can be made from a distance, the rigidity of his defenses, the absence of empathy, the reversal of blame, and the refusal to recognize her separate emotional reality all strongly point to a narcissistic structure. But what she described next moved the conversation into even more disturbing territory. Not just emotional invalidation and projection, like we're discussing, but what appeared to be a profound shift in his physical presence, mood states, and even consciousness. She went on to describe a man who was always quick to anger, had no filter, was cruel, very entitled and self-centered. But over time, she began to notice something even more unsettling, a shift not just in his behavior, but in his physical presence. She said, his eyes changed, and the color seemed slightly different. She described these episodes as, I quote, zones. These are altered states that he would slip into, sometimes for days, weeks, or even months. During these times, he became exceptionally cruel, angry, and rude, with a tone of voice that would change, and a capacity for emotional brutality that would escalate. It seemed to me that what she may have been witnessing was more than just mood swings or volatile behavior, as serious as those are. Her account of these, and I quote, zones, with their dissociative qualities and marked changes in affect, tone, and perhaps physical appearance, may suggest episodes of narcissistic decompensation. Psychodynamically, these moments can be understood as defensive collapses, where a fragile self-structure attempts to hold itself together through domination, projection, and attack. By fragile self-structure, I quote, fragile self-structure, we need to define that. We're referring to a personality organization in which the internal sense of self is unstable, lacking cohesion and continuity. In other words, there's often no integrated experience of self across time, no reliable internal framework to metabolize painful affects like shame, helplessness, or fear. And again, we digressed and we spoke about this quite a bit, but at the core of all personality disorders, and some of you may have heard me say this in prior episodes, is what we call a fragmented sense of self. And that's why you so often see something that we call splitting, which again, you may be familiar with. As a result of this fragile self-structure, the fragmented sense of self, aggression is not symbolized or mentalized, but instead acted out, often with brutal precision. In these states, affect floods the psychic system and cannot be named, thought about, or held in mind. Instead, these feelings, whatever they are, but it comes out as aggression, what happens, what we see on the surface, is these states, these affective states get discharged externally. So that means they just get put onto other people in their environment, which may be you. The partner or child becomes a container for these unbearable states, absorbing projected feelings that the individual cannot tolerate in themselves. So I hope I made that clear. Again, in the group, that took quite a bit of discussion, but in short, it's a projection, a ridding of something in oneself that they cannot bear to tolerate, and they put it in you. That's the blaming and calling you names. So if you're the recipient of this, or if you get into these states yourself, now I hope you have a better understanding when you're calling someone in your life evil or destructive. If you could put objective reality aside for a moment, hopefully this will help you get into a more reflective state and question, maybe some of this is coming from her, and maybe some of this is coming from me. So overall, what do we see here? We see that his behavior, particularly the absence of guilt or any reflective capacity when they argue, suggests a mind that's unable to think about its own mental states or the impact that it has on others. So it doesn't think about its own mental states or the mental state of people around you. In clinical terms, this may reflect a profound failure of what we call mentalization, in which others are not seen as separate people with their own minds and feelings, but rather as extensions of oneself, right? Because remember, that's the anger, but now the other person is angry, right? Or in more serious situations, threats to the self, right? And I went over this in earlier episodes, but if you're projecting anger, you're more prone to feel that people are going to be angry because you tend to live in an angry environment. Again, to return to her original question about whether he's a narcissist, his cruelty, combined with a lack of awareness or remorse, a fragile self-structure, that's the fragmented sense of self, and a desperate need to rid himself of unbearable feelings in order to regulate his self-esteem, all point to a narcissistic structure under severe internal threat. We don't hear about the specific triggers from her, but in my experience, states of narcissistic decompensation, like I'm describing here, the zones, right, that he gets into, and the rage are almost always precipitated by perceived rejection, disappointment, or a moment of vulnerability that punctures the defensive grandiosity. These are very subtle. So through close analysis with individuals who are narcissistically disturbed, I found that internal injuries, again, however minor they may seem from the outside, can feel annihilating from within, leading to cruel enactments as a form of psychic survival. This means that attacking or devaluing the other becomes the only available way to stabilize a collapsing internal world. In these moments, cruelty serves a function to disown unbearable feelings, restore a fleeting sense of control, and protect the self from fragmentation. This is a classic example of a long-term relational trauma where one partner, likely organized around narcissistic and dissociative defenses, consistently externalized blame and distorted reality to maintain a cohesive self-image and patch up his precarious self-esteem. When we encounter a story like this, one marked by sustained cruelty, emotional erasure, and a deeply disturbing relational dynamic, it's easy to focus entirely on his, her ex-husband's pathology, and rightly so. The behavior described is abusive, and no one deserves to be treated this way. But from a psychodynamic perspective, we're also invited to look, gently and curiously, at what might be happening inside the person who stayed. Not because she's to blame, but because there's often a deeper emotional logic at play, one that helps us understand why this kind of relationship feels familiar, compelling, or even inescapable. Looking at the unconscious relational patterns that keep someone bound to a harmful partner is not about fault. It's about finding a deeper meaning beneath what otherwise feels incomprehensible. If we can understand what this relationship represented emotionally, what unmet need it might have reenacted in her, we open the door to self-compassion, insight, and ultimately change. If you want to hear more about these complicated relational positions, including the possibility of what we call identification with the abuser, in other words, she came to talk about that at times she too became physically abusive or verbally abusive towards him. This is what we call identification with the aggressor, with the abuser. And what we refer to as, and I quote, the repetition compulsion, that's of an earlier trauma. So something gets repeated in contemporary relationships. But the idea, the concept of repetition compulsion is far more complicated, as you can imagine. And that deserves its own separate podcast, which I'm thinking about will come in the near future. Well, anyway, all of this, if you want to hear more about these things, right? The identification with the aggressor, the repetition compulsion, that's exactly the kind of exploration we save for office hours. This was just a glimpse, a sneak peek into the kinds of psychodynamic questions we sit with together. Why do we stay? Why do we behave in ways that are cruel or abusive? What are we unconsciously reenacting? And what begins to shift when we finally name and understand our own dismissive or hurtful patterns? If you're curious to explore issues like this and want to think more deeply about the hidden emotional logic beneath painful relationships, your support will help keep this podcast going. Please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review. That would be really helpful for this podcast, and share it with someone who might benefit. You can also join me in office hours. Okay, we have to begin to wrap this one up. I hope you found this valuable and insightful. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.